It is really a pleasure and an honor to greet Roland Erne, who will give a Carlo Azeglio Ciampi lecture on trajectory of transnational socio-economic protest in Europe since 1997. Roland Erne, many of you know him, is professor at the University College Dublin at the School of Business. He has been the principal investigator of an important ERC grant on labor politics and the EU, which is now completed. The book is ready and will be presented also here on another occasions. He has been at the University College Dublin since 2003, but with visiting and appointments in several important institutions, Cornell, Oslo, Oxford, l'École Normale Superiore, and others, working on the especially politizations of labor at the transnational level and the EU type of transformations, which is also at the basis of his other important book on labor unions, pointing at the importance of the unions in the development of the ideas of Europe. Our path crossed at the UI when Roland was finishing and I was starting my second life there as a professor in the Department of Political and Social Sciences. He is, I think, we have not seen each other for a long period, but then we started to meet more and more often. And I think that this is also a testimony of the fact that social movements and union studies that had been quite apart for a long period started to cross paths again, them as well. And in fact, we have also been together in a project on the transnationalizations of social movements led here by Chiara Milan. And I'm really looking forward to these contributions. I think the contributions to the encounters of social movement studies and labor studies, of national studies and cross-national studies, of EU politics with comparative politics. And it is a contribution also in methodological terms, which is quite important for us. And Roland is also a member of the steering committee of the Cosmos Lab, and has been helping us also with the development of ideas about how to study protest and how to develop protest event analysis in the directions in which systematic collections of information at the quantitative level can be combined also with a qualitative analysis, which is what he's going to do. So thank you very much, Roland, and you have the floor.
Very much, Donatella. And so I need a new microphone. Okay, so very good. We know each other from since the 80s and the 90s. And as with Donatella, so we haven't been in touch for many years, but we kind of still follow each other's work, and as you will see, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments after that. The background of this presentation goes back a long time as well, because why did I enter science or social science? I did it because I was worried about the concrete issue that we had in the 1990s, and still have today. And the issue is, how can we democratize the European Union? And we have written with colleagues kind of a small book or a bigger book in 95. And then just last week, I bumped on a Ryanair plane to Nicolas Schmidt, and I saw him reading this book, 30 Ideas for 2030. And actually, if you read the book, you see that not much has changed. So the ideas are still very similar. We need democratic participation rights, we need social rights, and the problem, therefore, is not, in my view, a problem of that we don't know what we should do to democratize the European Union, or it's not a problem that there are not nice designs how a more democratic EU could be, but the problem is that we need to make it happen. And that...
I didn't know who Nicolas Schmidt is.
Huh? He's the lead candidate of the European Socialists for this European election. He's the lead candidate for the position of von der Leyen, and he is currently the Minister of Labor, so to speak, the Commissioner for Employment and Social Affairs. So he is the one that did the Minimum Wage Directive or the Platform Workers Directive. So he's part of that drive where we have seen some progress in the labor field. And he reads book, as you see, and he was also very interesting. But the problem is, as I mentioned before, everybody is in favor of a more social and democratic union. And the European Union itself as well, so as it states in its own preamble. But the question is, how do we get there? So we need to go beyond democratic theory, we need to go beyond good ideas, blueprints, and that was then 10 years later the issue that triggered me to study labor unions, because labor unions have been at the center of democratization processes at the national level. And in my PhD here in Florence, which published with Cornell 2-3 years afterwards, I looked not what unions say, because of course unions are also for a social and democratic Europe, but what they do. So I looked at the behavior of trade unions in company merger cases, in cases of collective bargaining, and so to what extent they engage in transnational democratic action. And I saw that in some instances there was transnational collective action, in the case of the ABB-Alstom merger, for example, where unions united, politicized the event, went to Brussels, challenged the European Parliament, challenged the companies, and created a movement. So it's possible, but I also had to acknowledge that in most cases unions were behaving in another way, kind of limited to the national context, competitive cooperatism, this kind of frames. So when I presented the book, I was confronted with Baccaro at the book launch conference, and Baccaro said, you know, that's all well, and we could extend his comment to a lot of the studies on transnational social action. You know, that's all well. We have these very nice case studies on successful transnational collective action, on the Bolkestein Directive, on this case, on that case. But these actions don't show up in figures. So in Baccaro's terms, they're not really relevant. And then there is an additional problem that most research after the so-called cultural turn, we looked, and that's not just an issue of social movement studies, but also industrial relations scholars, we looked more at the cultural factors, the actor-center factors. How do actors manage to come together? How do we organize a feeling of commonality, etc.? But if we do use kind of actor-centered explanations, we can't actually go beyond and look at maybe some structural factors that could help see the development of transnational collective action. But that was still not enough for me to convince me, because when we did our ERC project, we still thought, okay, we now have the possibility of doing transnational field work in multi-sited ethnographic work in the 4 countries that I've selected at the same time. And we still wanted to look at kind of qualitative but more systematized kind of analysis. But then COVID came, bang, and said to us, I'm sorry, your research plan about qualitative research is finished because you have to be locked down and stay in house. So that sense, what I'm presenting today is also a result of COVID. So we looked back and said, what can we do? Okay, we can't go out. So we do try to look at data, try to gather data since the late 90s, since the Amsterdam Treaty, since the Stability and Growth Pact, see whether we see anything in terms of transnational action. First, of course, we looked at other people and other people in the room that did analyze protest events. So we are not the first ones into the field of protest events, not at all. So Kriesi and colleagues had their own ERC protest project and found these 30,000 protest events in this period from 2000 to 2015. And surprisingly for him and his colleagues, that most protests were motivated by economic claims, either towards governments or private employers, 38.1%, which is a surprise given the discussion that we have seen in past social movement studies that kind of cultural or other factors would be more important to trigger protests. But then we looked at the data. We also contacted colleagues working with Hanspeter. And then for our research question, we couldn't really use the database because it's based on the classical country-by-country research design. So we cannot establish, looking at Kriesi's database, whether a protest event measured in one country is linked to another one in another country. So what we did is, okay, we had time. We couldn't go to the field. We had some research, and we had kind of a privileged situation in a paradoxical lockdown situation. And we used these resources to create our own transnational protest database. And we did that to not just to measure what's going on, but also to test two political and economic explanations for transnational action that have been put forward in my field of industrial relations. So what we gathered is we looked at labor-related newsletters, so all newsletters of European Trade Union Confederation, not only at the ETUC, intersector, but also all sectoral ones, but then also labor newsletters at the national level in Germany, France, and Italy. Also on EU, a part of the EU as a whole, Central and Eastern European websites, specialized media, and we try to gather all protest events that have been mentioned there that are transnational. We looked at demonstrations, strikes, but also European citizens' initiatives. A European Citizen Initiative, I think, is an important tool. It has been used, but also it's something that has been introduced with the Lisbon Treaty that actually goes back to our book of 95, where we produced the proposed European Citizens Initiative. So some ideas have actually been taken on by European leaders. And then we looked at related protest events in more than 2 states, but also protests which are transnational in nature on site, with at least participants from 2 states, with 30 countries, 30 protesters participating. Then in the scope, we looked at economic, labor, and social policy narrowly defined. So kind of an old-fashioned working class politics focus. We did that not because we think that conflicts about gender, for example, or ethnicity are not part of modern working class politics, but we didn't want to measure the increasing salience of new topics over time. So we wanted to keep to focus on the same narrow definition of working class politics to see whether we see a change in this narrow area of working class politics. And then first we see something that would surprise Baccaro, because in the argument that he did about our book of 2009, he said, first, your protests don't show up in figures, and second, they will decline, because union is in decline everywhere. Union collective bargaining density goes down, and actually it is going down. So we established here the gray columns show the weighted average collective bargaining density in percent across the European Union, and we see as a proxy of labor power that collective bargaining density is declining everywhere. But at the same time, we see a rise of protests across time. And that is kind of surprising, almost a doubling from the first period to the latest period. And that is interesting because the latest period is post-austerity politics, so it's from 2015 to 20. Now, we did this database by looking at some of the explanations that have been put forward in the industrial relations literature. So Mark Anner and colleagues wrote a very important paper in the European Journal of Industrial Relations in 2006, where they look at transnational protests across sectors, but they mostly look at private sectors, mostly manufacturing. And the hidden assumption behind their focus is this economic explanation. So the more workers are exposed to transnational market pressures, horizontal market pressures, as I would say, the more they realize they have to act across national boundaries to counter this economic Europeanization and globalization processes. And so that is an empirical paper, but even before them, Andrew Martin from Harvard and George Ross has argued the same case. So in the 90s, when they saw that we are having the establishment towards the establishment of the EMU, so the argument was the more we have economic integration, the more we should expect transnational counter-reactions. How can we measure that? Whether this is an important argument is we have broken down our protest events by their sectorial location. And so we can see if the economic explanation is true, the rise or most protest events should happen in sectors, in private sectors that are exposed to international competition. But then already when I wrote the 2008 book, and then more even when I had the doubtful privilege to live in Ireland and half time also in Romania to have direct encounters with European executives implementing the new economic governance regime of the European Union, I argued that there is also a political explanation for transnational action. And that is not linked to the exposure of market competition, but the increasing exposure to vertical integration pressures or interventions when they point in a commodifying policy direction. So we start with the Amsterdam Treaty. The Amsterdam Treaty didn't provoke any protests. There was no referendum on the Amsterdam Treaty, although it increased the scope of European Union competence in employment policy. But nobody had a problem with that. The full employment should be, of course, an idea that everybody is in favor of. But the argument that we developed here was, so in the 2008 merger cases, so in the ABB Alstom case, what triggered the ABB Alstom workers to unite and go to Brussels was that the competition authority people allowed the merger to go forward, although it was clear that the merging companies breached European law by not consulting European Works Councils, according to the EU Works Councils Directive. So to see whether this is the key variable, we also kind of grouped our protests by levels and targets of action, and to see whether it's actually these EU interventions that are the cause or the trigger of these protest events. So now I come to the findings, and I've been asked this morning to reduce my slides because I have many slides, and if you want, I can give you the link to many tables and figures and etc. But I will only kind of present the summary figures for the argument. So the first table is the protest by sectors, and now over the whole period. We also broke it down and looked how that changes over time. So arguably, integrated transnational production networks, also the exposure to transnational competition here is important, but only in 98 out of 352 cases. So that is interesting, isn't it? Whereas we have transnational action of unions in national and local public services that went to unite with colleagues from other nations and other localities across Europe to protest, which is surprising because these are not exposed to competition of European civil servants that can also not be explained by kind of market competition. Then we also had some intersectoral protests against the capitalist system, against European social movements that address broad issues.
I'm told that you have to.
Okay, I'm walking too much. I'm walking too much, yeah, because I can't. Indeed. Okay. So what we can say now about the first hypothesis, if you look at the sectoral table, it's not completely wrong. It has some salience, but apparently it cannot explain everything. So let's look at the second table with the results to the political protests. And here we tried to cross-tabulate the levels of action on the one side and the targets of action on the other side. We start at the company level. Company protests target transnational companies, and in some sense they target vertical pressure from hierarchies, but hierarchies inside the company. Only at sectoral level, if you are in the area of industrial relations, only in sectoral level you can actually take horizontal market pressures out of competition. That is what normally happens in strikes in Germany and many other countries, where you strike in an entire sector for a collective agreement to set an equal level standard for an entire sector, taking kind of wages, for example, out of competition. But then we go a step further and we look at the political or governmental level, governmental tra virgolette, so to speak, because we include, of course, also European supranational administrations. And here we see 209 protest events out of 355 are actually directed at this level, at this political kind of addressees. And then we have had, even including in Florence when I was here, European Social Forum, other protests that try to change the whole system. So we have also some systemic protests as well. But what is important for our argument is this predominance of protests against supranational administrations. If we break down, I my apologies. I did keep this one supplementary site with tables because it's interesting. Because we could argue, how does it look if we break down these protests over time by participants, by protests, by the participant levels. And then we see, even if we do that, we cannot say that company level protests are to explain for the increase. So we have, if you take it together and if you read the paper as a whole, yes, company level protests increased over time, but so did also protests at the political and at the political level. So systemic levels declined. So this was the high time of European Social Forum. So we have less systemic protests, but still some protests on concrete actions with many participants at the European level. So that was my only additional table, but we have had in the paper some additional explanations or additional tables. So what we see, what is interesting is we don't see protest waves. So there is something going on beyond the ups and downs. So if you study protests at the national level, we see these ups and downs, even in the last 30 years. But here, maybe not. Bacaro might still say 355 events isn't 30,000 events or something like that. But of course, the 30,000 events our events are not equal to the 30,000 events, because if there is an event with a European Day of Action and it has actions in 40 cities across Europe, we only count it as one and not as 40 events or something like that. So they are not really comparable. But what we can say is something must be going on the transnational level, because we see a continued increase over time, and the increase continued to increase even after the post-austerity period. Then, as mentioned already, so our narrow definition of socioeconomic protests excludes the kind of the widening thematic scope of European labor politics that we have seen over the last 10, 15 years. And then we also looked at different protest types. The share between strikes, demonstration, boycotts, etc., remained largely the same. Of course, we didn't have European Citizens Initiative earlier, but we only have 2 or 3 of those anyway in our field. So, my conclusion. Transnational socioeconomic protests are driven much more by tangible vertical political integration pressures than by abstract horizontal market pressures. And I'm providing now a kind of a Marxist explanation for the end of class politics. So as Marx said, actually, it's very difficult for workers to see the social structure in the capitalist accumulation process, because on a capitalist market, the relationship between different producers take the form of relationship between goods. So it seems as if there is a kind of a natural force. So the relations, the social relations are kind of mystified, and many workers see this horizontal market pressure not as a result of political action or any action. They see it as a result of nature, so to speak. And this mystifying character of capitalist accumulation that Marx recognized in the chapter 1.4 in his Capital is becoming even more important the more we are going into a transnational, globally integrated market force, because it is even more difficult to realize the social construction, the social forces behind this so-called horizontal market competition. And Burawoy recognized that. So that's actually the biggest contradiction or the biggest paradox in Marx's analysis is how can there be class struggle if the exploitation is mystified by these processes? And it is indeed much more easy to politicize this concrete horizontal market, it's more easy to politicize these vertical political integration pressures. So you cannot stop the times of Europe with the 90s, with the introduction of the euro and the common market process, the times where European integration could go forward as a kind of technocratic event behind closed door, that has stopped. It was leading to politicization, as Hanspeter and colleagues have outlined in this book. And this book led them to their own ERC project, from which I've quoted the results before. And as you see in the logo, so there is the argument, yeah, there is not just the left-right, that's of the past kind of, but now we have the division between liberal cosmopolitans against nationalists on the other side. So kind of another dimension of conflict. You see our book that is coming out has a very similar title, a similar layout as well. So it's also two words. We call it Politicizing Commodification. Because we argue that these new forms of socioeconomic protests are related to a change in the capitalist accumulation regime that we are seeing in Europe. And actually, Italian researchers have anticipated in the 1970s already, Negri and others. So when Pizzorno and Crouch and many others, including Hanspeter, were studying kind of class conflicts at the factory floor, they have said, we are maybe seeing a change of capitalist accumulation processes where the conflict shifts from the factory floor to society writ large. And in other words, to conflicts about the commodification of labor relations and public services. So that has then been motivating the major research of our ERC project, which is not about this protest event. As I mentioned, this is just a kind of a byproduct thanks to COVID, because we had some years of work where we couldn't go to the ground. So the major contribution of our ERC project is actually looking at the policy direction of EU governance interventions. And we did that in employment relations, public service in general, and in the health sector, in the water sector, and the public transport sector. And we did that in relation to Romania, Italy, Germany, and Ireland. Note, we don't say that the national level is not important. But going beyond methodological nationalism just means that we have to relate what we observe at the national level to transnational processes like the economic governance process. So we already started with Hanspeter debate about this, but maybe we can continue that another time because there is another event on the book. So we should focus on the current paper. So we argue that labor politics matters. So that's why politics is maybe there writ large. Your comments matter too. So I'm looking forward to Hanspeter's and Guglielmo's comment, your comments from the audience, and the people out there online. You have seen here my email address, and Jörg Nowak, our postdoctoral researcher, is now professor in Brasilia. So he moved from Dublin to Brazil, and so we are happy to comment or kind of respond to your comment, and we really look forward to your comments also because this paper is not published. So we still have a chance to take on your advice. And thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Roland. Very, very interesting. I'm going to introduce now the two discussants, starting with Hanspeter Kriesi, who, as Roland mentioned, has been at the basis of many ideas that have been developed in the research that has been presented now. Hanspeter has done a lot to analyze social movements and to analyze Europeanization, as well as to develop the protest event analysis with promoting many methodological turn. This is done since we met in the early 90s until we met again in around 2010 at the UI, where he's still professors, part-time professors, and conducted many, I think, more than one ERC granted project. So welcome, Hanspeter, and you have the floor.
Yes, of course.
Now, as Roland said, we go back a long time. We are both Swiss, but in my memory, we really met for the first time in Ireland, because you invited me for a talk at UCL. So UCD, I got for the first time to Ireland, and since then we met regularly. Now, this is for me, it was unexpected that you do research on protest. And it's fascinating stuff, but I'm still relatively critical of what you do in this paper, and I will comment on the paper. I have 4 comments on levels of transnational socioeconomic protest, on trends of transnational socioeconomic protest, competing hypotheses, and the meaning of the results. The first on levels. I mean, you said it, there are 30,300. So it's 1% of what we found in similar periods is transnational. And because there is so little, we just neglected it. Now, there is a precedent to your study which has been done by Doug Imig and Sidney Darrow, and which was called Europeanization of contention. And already at the time, they found almost no European protest, except one, which you exclude explicitly from your study, although it's also socioeconomic protest, the farmers. And as you saw this spring, I mean, if the farmers bring out their tractors, then even the European Commission backs down. So I would say you left out the most important. But I mean, you explained why you did it, and that was not of your interest. But I would claim that if you want to study transnational socioeconomic protest, you should include the farm. Because the CAP is the most important economic policy of the European Union. Now the trend, you find an increasing trend, and this is really very interesting, because I show you now a few slides of our own work which show declining trends of protest across Europe. And we do this in a paper. I mean, we extended our data series to up to 2022 so far. And we do this in a paper which has not been published yet, which will be part of a special issue on protest in Europe of JEP, which will be edited by the WZB people, Sven Hutter and Endre Borbat and others. So here you see the trend in the number of events monthly from 2000 to 2021, roughly. And the vertical lines are the beginning of three crises: the Eurozone crisis, the refugee crisis, and the COVID crisis. And you see that already during the Eurozone crisis period, there is a precipitous decline of protest. Now, we distinguished, you pointed out that there is economic and cultural protest, and we distinguish between the two. And what you see, that the black solid line is economic protest, and the gray line is cultural protest. You see that the economic protest is mainly responsible for the decline, and it remains at a very low level since the refugee crisis. So in general, economic protest has gone down enormously. And cultural protest has gone down too, but has started to rise again. There is Fridays for Future, there is Black Lives Matter, and there was a lot of COVID protest, although it was difficult to protest in COVID times because it was forbidden to protest. But astonishingly, there was relatively much COVID protest, which we put all under cultural because it was mainly against lockdowns and vaccination, not against economic measures. The economic measures were very popular. And finally, I'll show you this graph, which is related to what I just showed, is very interesting. Economic protest is much more based on organizations than cultural protest, because economic protest is mainly organized by unions. So the decline of economic protest has also something to do with the decline of the capacity of unions to organize protest, or capacity or motivation to organize protest. Whereas the unorganized cultural protest is mainly rather unorganized. Protest has resurged. Now my third comment, the competing hypotheses. You have the economic hypothesis, which finds partial confirmation. There is an increase of protest events in transnational integrated sectors, but I would say importantly, there is even a stronger increase, and in the paper you pointed this out, in the European public sector. Then the political explanation, you say protest is above all triggered by vertical interventions of corporate, and in paper you show mainly from the transport and metal industry sectors, and by political institutions, especially summits. So if you compare these two, you showed it, the political explanation wins hands down. But maybe there are other explanations which you don't consider. And I just ask questions, I don't know it. But one is the crisis. So, we study crisis in our ERC project now. There was the Eurozone crisis. There was the refugee crisis, Brexit, COVID-19, and the social crisis. Did these crises have any impact on transnational socio-economic protest? I think the Eurozone crisis certainly did. There were transnational protests against austerity measures, but you show that the protest increases. So maybe it's not the crisis, because after the European Eurozone crisis, transnational protest actually increased. So could it be something else? Could it be something about the actors? And could it be that the transnational protest we see now is maybe protest against European public sector employers? So against employees protesting against their organizations, supranational organizations, or against transnational corporations. Which brings me to the meaning of the results. at the end of the paper, and you didn't go into it in the presentation, you say there are two reasons for this protest. On the one hand, there is response to EU labor laws deemed to undermine labor standards of public services. And on the other hand, there is a response to the new economic governance regime, and in particular to its commodifying country-specific prescriptions. Now I ask, how do you know? And I went to your book, because in the paper you don't go into this, but in the book there are two tables on page 303, where you show, you detail these political protests, and you show that there is a lot of protest in the first category. I think 2/3 are against EU labor laws, but there is virtually none in the second category. And then you say, yeah, there is none in the second category, but it's still very important, and protest is still oriented towards this kind of new economic governance regime. It's just national protest. So it occurs in the individual member states. And of course, that would be one of my arguments why you find so little transnational protest, because protest against EU interventions takes place at the national level. Most of this protest against austerity was protest in Greece. I mean, the Greeks, they mobilized enormously, and much of the wave we found in the Eurozone crisis was due to the Greeks. And they all did it at the national level. The employee protest I already mentioned. Now, to identify the meaning of the results, we need more detailed information about the goals of the protest. And my question is whether you coded the goals, the demands of the protests, and what were they all about. In the paper, you don't have anything to say, and I would encourage you that one better understands the meaning of all of this to have a section on the goals, the demands that are linked to the protests. That was it.
Thank you very much, Hanspeter. And without presentation, I give the floor to Guglielmo Meardi, just saying he's the dean of...
Thank you, Donatella. Thank you, Roland, for being with us. It's a pleasure to meet you again. We met regularly in different places around Europe, but it's nice in particular to meet in Florence, given that we met the first time in Florence. And looking back 2.5 decades or so, first at the UI, we were among the extremely few people who were interested in the working class, where people were already starting to be only interested in ambassadors and people like that. And then we were, among the first non-local in the Anglo-Saxon industrial relations core institutions. Since then, really things changed in the sense of the variety of voices and the variety of research and the contamination between continental and Anglophone perspectives, and very much of that is your merit of all the European research you've been done in the last 2-3 decades. So that's great, and I also, in general, appreciate your argument that labor. I mean, first, labor is crucial in the democratization, both at the national and transnational level. It requires action. It will not happen just by hierarchy, and that action will occur, is more likely to occur against the visible hands of hierarchies, whether multinational companies or the European Union, rather than against the invisible hand of the market. So that's certainly a very important perspective. Now, I have a couple of rather general reflections, maybe 3.5. The first one is about your expectation, that is in the chart about the fact that transnational protest goes up, and even if trade union power goes down. And where you're setting very much the, expectation and therefore also the value of your findings, the importance of the novelty of your findings. Now, the relationship between protest and trade union labor power, however, is much more complex. So it's not necessarily the case that protest will go down because trade unions are less powerful. And you use in particular an indicator of collective bargaining coverage, which is a very important indicator, but its relations to protest is very, very, very far. I mean, Austria has 100% coverage, is also a very low strike behavior country, and there are many cases like that. In particular, I would say that if we look back at what people were saying 25, 30 years ago, although people were aware of trade union decline, very much. I mean, they've been aware for 40 years. There was some expectation, whether enthusiastic or very moderate or very cautious, but basically, unless you were Wolfgang Streeck, already in the late 90s, you were thinking that labor will have to do something more at international, transnational level, because this is how the world is going. So whether you were a functionalist, whether you were in a believing spillover, whether you were a world system behavior, whether you were a Marxist or whatever, you were aware of how difficult it was. Right? So you may have thought, well, it will require a lot of time and a lot of investment and so on, but labor will have to do more at the international, transnational level. So unless you were Wolfgang Streeck, or maybe unless you were Scandinavian, you would have argued that. So I think the expectation that you set here now that, well, we should expect transnational action to go down is a fair one, but only in one sense. And more specifically, with regard to protest, well, in labor relations, protest usually is considered equal strikes. Okay, although you have a much broader definitions. And from the study of strikes, again, we don't know exactly how strikes are linked to labor power. I mean, to the point that, for instance, myself, when I look at the trend of change in industrial relations, I don't use it. I don't include in strike statistics. They change too much over time because of different regulation, because of structural changes in the economy, and it's impossible to say whether a lot of strikes is because labor is powerful or it's because labor is desperate. There is no theoretical reason to be able to say one rather than the other. If when they don't strike, it's because they are weak or because they obtain what they wanted, they're relatively happy. We don't know in advance. But Carlo and Howell, they do include strike statistics in their picture of the neoliberal transformation. However, to recognize it to them, in a specific, I think in a specific way, that is, to support their argument that there is neoliberal transformation, they add also the fact that labor is not able to protest against it. But it's not, the strike by themselves are not an aspect of neoliberal transformation. It's an aspect of the fact that labor is not really very much able to do very much against it, which is a little bit different. Moreover, if we look at your data and we compare it to what we know about strikes, you show an increase in number, which is interesting, we'll go back to that. But you also show in this other picture where you have all the big cakes in different colors, okay? You use this chart in order to show that the difference in level hasn't changed very much. But there's also another big story, I think, here, is that all the increase in numbers of protests from 1997 to 2020 occurs in the smallest category. Whereas the largest category does from 100,000 over, they all decline actually quite a lot. So it's probably the same that we've seen, I mean, it's not the same, but it's similar to what we've seen in strike statistics. The collapse in strike behavior is huge if you consider in terms of volume, that is of days of strike lost. It's also huge in terms of participants. It's not big or actually it's hardly there in terms of number of strikes. So we still have a lot of strikes, only instead of having the minor strikes and the 100,000 people on strike for a year, you have 20 people on strike here for half an hour, 50 people on strike there for half a day, 200 people on strike there for 2 days. And so from this data, what I gather is quite easy. I mean, if you make an estimate of the size, it's the likely story is that, I mean, I would say, I'm sure about it. There is an increase in number of protests, but also a sharp decline in the number of people who protest. I think that is an important part of the story, which in a way changes both your expectation and also your assessment, your relatively positive assessment of what is going on, positive in the sense of the chances of protest. Also, the other thing we obviously see, and we know about strikes, is that the strikes have moved from the private sector to the public sector. So what you link specifically to the European governance may also just reflect the fact that economic protest has moved from the private sector to the public one, regardless of the European Union, in all countries, whether in Europe or elsewhere, basically everywhere in the world, including in emerging countries. The second point is about the relationship, on the relationship with the EU. Already, Hanspeter has mentioned the farmers, and I will go back on that because that is very interesting. The recent protest of the so-called tractor protest, okay, which obviously is outside I'm not complaining that you haven't included in your data set, all right? But what is interesting on that? Related to your argument about protest against the visible hand of the European Union. This was mostly a protest, anti-EU protest, okay? In most countries it was, you have more or less far-wide populist, call them as you like, actors behind them. With one exception. In one place, in one country, the tractors protest had European Union flags. Which country? The United Kingdom. Which confirms, and we have already known, that the European Union looks all the better the further away you are from it, and all the worse the closer you are to it. So farmers were a driver of Brexit. Now they realize how much they lost, access to markets, subsidies, and so on. They have the European Union flags. So that's why is that important? Well, that important because obviously is a challenge how you mobilize. You have to leave the European Union in order to get European struggles and so on. It's a bit complicated. But also you have to look at the fact what these protests were against. They were against fuel prices and against the rules about soil. You have to regenerate soil in a more biological, whatever, organic, environmental friendly way. So they were against green policies. And that, I think, is very interesting. Sorry, I mean, maybe I'm going a little bit outside, but I think it's really important to link the economic and social protests with what is happening in the environment, environmental politics. We have the elections, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure, in June when you visit again. We'll have the European elections. And there are three scenarios after the European elections. One is that the current majority more or less survives, okay? Which may happen, maybe is the most likely thing. But then there are two other scenarios. One is that it doesn't survive or is too weak to survive on its own, so it will have to include the right, the ECR, that is Giorgia Meloni, which is what von der Leyen was arguing for this morning before our lecture. I think this is relatively less likely, but it's possible. And then the third possibility is that it will be weaker, but instead of enlarging towards the right, it will include the Greens. I think that would be huge for your field of study, because what we are seeing across Europe is the mobilization of economic protest against green policies. So far, the Greens and the European Union, or against the European Union, so far the Greens and the European Union were not the same thing. Sometimes they were a bit associated, but if they become exactly the same thing, the potential, I mean, that would be the best possible news for every populist far-right organization. You have the perfect enemy because the two most unpopular things, that is green policies and the European Union, merge. Unpopular, obviously, among the conservative part of the population. Only yesterday, the First Minister of Scotland resigned on green policies because green policies were unpopular. So this possibility which in a way is linked to the explanation. That is that you protest if you see a visible hand. That visible hand will be so visible and so green after June if the Greens join the European, let's say, majority, let's call it as it is. A final point on horizontal, that is a very small comment. The last two are small comments on your paper. We'll have other opportunities to talk about it. The first one is on horizontal, why the horizontal pressure don't lead to European protests. I perfectly agree with you. I would add a couple of little nuances on this. For instance, when you look at multinationals, some cases in which there is protest is because labor managed to create the so-called community of risk. So they realize a similarity of risk across locations, and they also managed to see the counterparts further away. This is why many have said that it's easier to find it in American multinationals than European-based multinationals. European-based multinationals, the strategy will be different. Let's say it's a French multinational, the French unions will lobby the French government, the other ones will be against it, so there will be different opinions. If it is an American multinational, well, then all European will be against the American multinationals. Maybe there's a problem with alliance with American labor, but that is for another time. And also, I think when you say, I really like your conclusion about Marx, putting Bauer in it, it's not just the nature of capitalism and the fetishism of money and commodities and so on, but also I would say, in comparison to 25 years ago, multinationals have not been still. So they are ideological actors. They have invested so much in, in showing that they are socially responsible and whatever else that they prevented. They are really important ideological actors in terms of preventing protests against them. They show that they pretend to be progressive. They're very active in culture. It's difficult to hate Google. Because you use it a lot. It's not as easy as it was with the traditional, textile sector bad employer was really, visibly bad. Finally, on methods, the very last comment is, although I like your approach and your description of data and so on, what you're doing is not just descriptive. What you're doing is also inferential. Actually, even explicitly, you use the inference word. So you say that there are some trends in time, and there are some trends in distribution between sectors and levels and so on. So you use some concepts that go outside, let's say, the physical data that you've collected. And that is fine, but that all rests on the fact, if you leave it in this language, rests on the fact that you expect your data set to match with some error of measurement. It always happens, it's forgivable, with the population. That is, you actually manage to have the full picture of all protests. Your data, your events are actually the events that happen. Obviously there will be some mistakes, but these mistakes are irrelevant. If that is not true, obviously, then if you want to do inference, you have to use different methods. It becomes much more complicated, and that is key because, for instance, you have the European citizenship initiatives, which are included. But European citizenship initiative only started in 2007, so already you have a slight difference in the composition of your data and whether you can infer from the fact that numbers in your sample increase, whether this reflects actually what happens in protests more in general, is something that may require some caution. But anyway, thank you very much for your presentation and your provocations on what is happening and for stalking the European Commission candidates. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both discussants, and I think it is only fair to give Roland now some time to respond before opening the floor to the public.
Thank you very much. Guglielmo's last comment relates actually to Hanspeter's first comment. How do we interpret these findings? And as you know, I'm an industrial relations scholar, originally a political scientist, and still am a political scientist. I'm seen by industrial relations people as the most political science person that there is in this field. But still, I'm in the field of industrial relations. So therefore, I don't have the privilege of other social movement scholars to switch their sides. When there is a protest in other parts, so we study them. And then we go to another one, there's protest there, and then we study them. So I'm stuck with socioeconomic field and industrial relations. And therefore, unfortunately, I can't study farmers' protests. But I think it's good, because when you mentioned Taro and colleagues, you answered my question, actually, and also answer yours. What's the meaning? The meaning is that Taro and colleagues didn't find non-protests, and now we found 353. So the comparison is not, I'm not arguing, as you implicitly imply, what's the meaning of transnational protests against national protests? I'm just saying here we have a field that is starting to be merited to be studied beyond just the occasional case study of Bolkenstein protests or this protest, whatever. So we are now in the phase, in a new field, establishment of a new field, transnational protests, where we can start for the first time, because we have some numbers, to try to get some inferences of the trends that we are seeing there. So that's the first answer to your point, Hanspeter. And the second, of course, is you cannot compare 355 to 30,000, because our one is not your one. So when we have the European protest general strike of the ETUC in November 2012, we only count it as one. But there may be hundreds of protest events. We could cross-tabulate and go down to the national media and then see where events have happened on the ground. So we don't, so in that sense, the data is not comparable, because if, as we said when we presented, when we have a protest event on a day of action, which actions across Europe, and that was one of the big actions with millions of participants across Europe. It's only one in our database, and not how many you have had.
May I say something about
Yep.
this?
Go.
You count the event if it occurs in 2 countries. So the threshold is relatively low, and you count if the event takes place in successive days. It's successive events. So it's if there is that's what you write.
Okay, so that is maybe not clear in my writing. So so when we that is an error. So it is one day of action counts as one in the database. So I have to double check that, but good point. Second, you bring in the second important issue is what triggers, and you looked at the crisis. Is the crisis kind of a trigger? And we say, no, it's the, more in the book than in the article itself. It's the policy orientation of EU governance interventions. So if the policy orientation commodifies employment relations or the provision of public services. And it's true that you mentioned what is interesting is the continued increase of protests even in the so-called post-austerity period. If you read our book, you will see that in the post-austerity period, the EU economic governance regime stopped promoting wage cuts, stopped promoting cutbacks of public expenditure. But what we saw is prescriptions continued to commodify the provision of public services. So if there was, in the European economic governance regime, there was some leeway of more investment, the more investment was channeled towards public-private partnership, was channeled and made conditional on the on the use of this additional money in a commodifying sense, and even more so with the so-called resilience and recovery finance package. That was in the public service, so that was a response to the health crisis. And ironically, if you read the conditionalities attached to that, is the money can be used in healthcare and has been used in healthcare, but cannot be used to fund nurses, cannot be used to fund so-called occurring expenditure of that should be paid for by the national government. So the additional money should be used for infrastructure, should be used for additional kind of expenditure that would actually be commodifying, because the recipients of that would all be private providers and not. So the public hospital can build a new public hospital, which then profits private constructors of public hospitals, or it can buy IT infrastructure, which also goes to private provision. So, and then what we have seen, if we analyze the data which you quoted in our book, it's true, and it, as actually we predicted, that the country-specific NAG prescriptions to commodify public services only provoked protest events in a very narrow group, namely on transnational ones, transnational protests. So there was transnational protest against the commodification of port services in Portugal, for example. So where the dockers in Northern Europe struck in support of the Portuguese dockers. But most of the protests so the NAG regime was also designed in that way to prevent the transnationalization of protests, because they made the experience that if you have a European directive like the Bolkestein directive, you create the counter-reaction. So by having your commodifying agenda, putting them in kind of salami slice tactics approach in prescriptions country by country, it is easier to get the message through and to kind of implement them. But then in healthcare, we have seen people start to come together and realize, hey, they are actually confronting us with commodifying policy prescriptions in healthcare from Germany to Italy to Ireland to Romania. And we have one part of the increase of transnational protests, including the protests I traveled to when I bumped into the European Commissioner on my flight to Brussels, were protests where healthcare workers across Europe started to protest not specific prescriptions, but EU intervention in the area of healthcare more generally defined. So not a specific law, because there is no specific law, but against the commodification of healthcare. So that's the poster, also the front page of one of those protests at the cover of the book is precisely that. So it's true, last point to you, I actually agree that your critique of the relationship between power and protests, the first point, I just mentioned it because it's Baccaro's argument. So I use them against Baccaro just to say, yeah, that doesn't work. So in that sense, I agree with you. And then, and then last but not least, I'm actually less pessimistic about European elections, because there are some paradoxical things going on. In European economic governance or European politics, I mentioned before, which government in the National Recovery Plan said that European economic governance funding should also be used to fund nurses or teachers, shall not be used just for infrastructure. So that is a kind of a classical social democratic demand. You know, if you want, and on the other side, those on the European Union side said, no, we can't do that because we don't give money to nurses or teachers because that's national competence. So the argument to argue the opposite is the most radical anti-national argument. It's an argument in favor for European competence to fund these. Which government put that in the National Recovery Plan? It is the Orban government, ironically. So that shows that arguments about national competence don't necessarily follow. So what matters is not the national competence as such. So we say we should look at the policy content of European policies and see how people place themselves. And yeah, the last thing, of course, also last week, we have had the adoption, the final adoption of the supply chain, corporate due diligence in the supply chain directive, so Lieferkettengesetz. We had the directive supporting the platform workers, giving platform workers more rights. That was approved against the liberals in Europe, against the FDP of Germany, and in one case also Macron of France. And on the other side, there was an alliance starting from the communist labor minister in Spain until the neo-fascist labor ministers in Italy and Hungary. So that shows that maybe the longer the debate, or if unions or social movements can politicize the topic rather than the big question, if the focus focuses on concrete issues, this polarization across the cosmopolitan national axis is maybe less important. I don't say it's not important, but it's not a cross anymore. So maybe if next project you should have not a cross, but a rectangle. I would argue that the left-right cleavage is more significant than this other cleavage, which is important because then the distance between these two here is smaller than the distance from this on the bottom to that on the other side.
Oh. Thank you very much. I open the floor now for comments.
The definition of transnational, given that there is one thing of having protest in Brussels, and because the decision-making center is there, and another if you have across many countries in the world, from Brazil to Japan, because the decision maker, they're not addressing the decision maker, but they're raising awareness about the environment or something else. Is it truly transnational if we go to Brussels, just as people from Indiana and Michigan go to Washington, D.C. as well to protest about the car industry or farming subsidies? Is it not transnational if you have protest only in Hungary, but you have the presence of so many international NGOs and visibility and solidarity actions in a local environment, but with a greater involvement of transnational actors in that place? So the definition of transnational is my first question. The second question is regarding the distinction between economic and cultural causes. Because for me, the anti-lockdown protest, for instance, had also an economic dimension. They were led by people who had restaurants and businesses and hotel industries. Even anti-immigration protest, we know that anti-immigration sentiments have an economic component as well as a cultural component among those who are anti-immigrant. Anti-fascist as well, Antifa, to which degree students and others are protesting against austerity or precariat. So the distinction between these two suggests that it's not just unions who are taking collective action, but also there are mixed reasons and mixed levels as well. And finally, with regard to your explanation, the Marxist explanation, I'm very much fond of combining Marxist with public choice arguments, although this is different. The logic of collective action means that actors economize on where and how they're going to protest. So if there's not an addressee, if there's not a decision-making agent, they're not going to lobby or introduce protest there, which is when they have specific claims, like the unions and other lobbies, as opposed to those who want to raise awareness, in which case it makes sense to have a transnational presence everywhere for the environment, for climate and other issues that where the purpose is not claiming, but raising awareness. Thank you.
You prefer I collect a couple of, and Jonathan?
Yeah,
please.
let's go.
Good. So I will have a chance to engage with some of the arguments with the book on June 17th. So I want to focus just on the presentation today. And here I really want to take up 2 points which have been raised already by the discussants. And I would really want to strongly support what both discussants said about the problem of excluding the agricultural sector. I mean, for me, this is not a study of transnational socioeconomic protest. It is at best a study of transnational labor protest. And I don't find it a convincing argument to say I'm an industrial relations scholar. So I think if you want to publish the paper, I would strongly encourage you to narrow the claims that you're making here. And I think it would indeed be very interesting to try to include agriculturalists and other socioeconomic groups in the analysis. That would give us a picture of what the lens over time might be very different from the picture that you show us. The second point that I wanted to focus on is the trends over time. And here I have simply been eyeballing some of the figures, both in the paper, but also the book itself. And one thing which I think is really very striking, and here does perhaps anticipate some on June 17th, is that if I look at your a real collapse of transnational labor protest on employment, on directly employment issues after 2015. Very intense in your tables in the crisis austerity era, but 2016 is a clear turning point. And then when you look at what is happening in the pandemic period, many of the events that you identify are actually demonstrations in support of EU policies. Commission's proposal for gender pay, or their very general things like a World Day for Decent Work, and so on. So that really supports the view that 2015, 2016 of the EU interesting. If we look at the other, then you have protests on public service. Health sector is more.
Thank you. Hans-Jörg?
Yes, I have a similar question to the one that was raised by the person here in the back, which is about the transnationalization of political mobilization of protest. And here I remember there was a debate already when the book by Tarrow and McAdam came out, that protest event analysis might be increasingly insufficient as a measurement, especially of the transnationalization of political mobilization. And this has to do with various factors, most importantly, because forms of mobilization are changing. Mobilization takes increasingly non-public forms. It can be highly efficient in the form of lobbying in the EU. And secondly, because the visibility might simply be systematically lower of transnational forms of protest. So the forms of measurement of protest event analysis that depend on visibility do not really cover it. And then it might be also simply the case that citizens, when they engage transnationally, do this differently. For instance, through social media campaigns or other forms of civic engagement that are not covered by protest event analysis. So I think we need to go back here to the question, why are we interested in forms of transnational political action in the first place? And here I think the interest is simply that we wish to understand whether there are same concerns finding expressions in different political arenas, whether these shared concerns drive forms of political mobilization in a broader sense, so not just protest, but alternative forms of political mobilization, and how effective are these forms. So my impression is that the more narrow analysis on protest here loses important dimensions. You, of course, can argue we found 30,000 protest events, so it is not just a marginal, and it also gains some visibility. But still, my guess is that there are other forms of political mobilization beyond protest that escape the attention, especially when you are dealing with industrial relations.
Someone want to intervene in the next?
Are spot on why we are doing it as it is. Sorry. Okay. So I start again. So thanks for the question. So we are, as you have seen in my introduction to the introduction today to the presentation, which is not in the paper. So we are interested in shared concerns because we believe that if you want to have a democratic European Union, it's not enough just to have nice policies or nice headlines. So we need to have people acting together across national boundaries. So that is the starting point. But more precise to Ari's first point, come back to other points afterwards. We talk about transnational when there is so the case if there is a demonstration in so there was a case, for example, a demonstration, one of the national protests against the Greek government closing down one public service, namely the public radio station, and that happened across a national level. That's a transnational protest, so it doesn't need to be a Brussels protest in that sense. So if there is a transnational action and we have documents based not just on labor trade union sources, but also on social movement sources, so it's broader than just labor related, it's also social movement sources, then we have included that in our analysis. It's true what you say, I don't disagree, and I think I hinted at that. Many, and we have written another pieces about migration and other issues, there is a socioeconomic dimension in many of the other topics, but for this, we just had a narrow focus on socioeconomic protest, narrowly defined, and we excluded farmers for the fact that farmers are most of the time self-employed or actually employers. Whereas we included doctors because doctors and junior doctors are employees, and it's true they have been not new to the table of protest politics, new to the table of transnational action, but that is a result to the marketization of health systems, which has also been prescribed by European economic governance prescriptions even after 2015. So what we see, I think, and maybe we can go out, we will debate that in next time. So when we analyze the country-specific prescriptions across our field of employment relations and public services, we distinguish between quantitative and qualitative prescriptions. So the quantitative about curtailment of wages, curtailment of money on the one side, but then the qualitative one about the marketization of services or the marketization of employment relations patterns. And if we do that distinction, we can say, yes, the cutbacks have stopped in 2015. But all the qualitative interventions afterwards, most of them, at least in most cases in healthcare very clearly, went still into a commodifying policy orientation, which then explains why we have protests of people that are not normally protesting, like doctors at the European Doctors' Action Day in Brussels, or other healthcare workers. So that is maybe some comments, but I should not monopolize my thing. I just saw on my list that I have not responded also to a point that Guglielmo said. You mentioned there are no protests in Google, or it's actually wrong. So they have had a European strike, and it's in our database. So there is a walkout of Google workers for equal rights, equal pay for men and women. And even Ryanair, we have seen transnational action in Ryanair. So there as well, maybe it's similar in some sense in these corporate hierarchies. And that's something, an insight we can actually take from Anna and colleagues. So this horizontal market pressures is one thing, but then there are corporations try to mimic them by designing kind of an economic governance regime which uses key performance indicators and site-specific prescriptions for different locations in order to prevent transnational action. And that works for some time until workers, for instance in Ryanair, start to realize that actually face the same problem. So as we have seen kind of maybe a learning effect that there is possibility of transnational action, I think in health sector we can clearly show there is a similar learning effect, that people that are not used to this idea of kind of acting transnationally are now at the forefront of transnational action, which is a surprise. So we wrote also, if you go to our website, we don't need to read the whole book, but Sabina Stan and I wrote a specific paper on healthcare, which shows that in socioeconomic review, shows that very clearly. And then ironically, also the people that were part of the big protests, like Angelo Otto that did the Otto coordinator of the protests in Genoa many years ago, he will now interview me next week in Radio Popolare, specifically on these healthcare protests. So there is some continuity, but maybe the decline of the big events that you mentioned is that necessarily bad. It's kind of, instead of fighting against capitalism and everything, like un altro mondo è possibile, etc., to be more targeted. Okay, then we have less people, but you can still have several 10,000 people that may be more effective than andiamo fare un altro mondo, etc.
Thank you, Mario, and then I'll ask something myself.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I think we are at the crossroad of different dynamics, social movement waves, political contention, institutional change, trade union, industrial relations. So what you capture is a subset of events which is basically an overlapping of different dimensions. I think an important overarching element that emerges is the fact that European politics is becoming an area of contention of greater relevance for what you can define more events of struggle which are more or less related to capital-labor relationships more than broader socioeconomic themes in general. In the back of your mind, capital-labor issues is what defines your boundaries of the subset, no? Including the public sector employment. So in this case, we have a clear enlargement of the scope of European policies, services, water, market competition, beach organization, and everything like that. And therefore, there are more social groups which are challenged in some forms or another, and therefore they can shift the focus of their contention to a European scale. At the same time, however, this would require a closer understanding of the stakes and of the agenda, because if we are talking about a neoliberal agenda and commodification and so on, this is quite straightforward in conceptual terms. But now with the Green Deal things, the questions are becoming much more complex, and therefore the nature of the conflict can be more nuanced, not just the rejection of a neoliberal agenda, but perhaps support of some type of green transition, or opposition to another type of green transition, or qualification and clearly in this area we have this mixing of political and economic actors, which is important. So in a way, the next step could be to focus more homogeneous agendas of a contention and of policy, the interaction between policy agendas and priorities of protest. Finally, here we see that we clearly have a missing character in the plot, the transnational social actors. So we have the unions who play some role in the story, but then the rest is ad hoc coalition, sometimes the social forums, then the water network, then the health worker coordination. So there is a clear a missing social actor with a strong transnational horizon, which can become the counterforce so there is still an asymmetry between the national and the European level, because you have European level capital, European level political power, European level technocratic agencies, but you don't have a European level social actor, besides the weakness of the coordination of trade unions. And for the trade unions, we see in your data that there is no the birth or the growth of a transnational labor movement capable to counter the transnational strategy of firms. If you think of Stellantis, for instance, you see that the French are privileged by the reorganization of the company, the Italians, the Polish, the Romanian are played one, or the Serbians are played one against the others, and therefore the weakness of the response of labor seems to be important. But thank you for bringing us on all these complex issues on the table.
Thank you. I wanted. Is there other comments?
Just one remark. I think it's all about also the perception and representation about transnational and national. I think I'm a Swiss living in Italy and watching German TV. But what I see there is the representation, for instance, all the strike waves from the last months in Germany, they are not happening in Italy. When I talk to Italians, they say, well, Germany is very good, no? The employers, the Germans don't strike. And then I tell them, well, you are not informed, no, about what happens the last months and how they were strong also in bargaining. What was the last conclusion? 70% more in money, no? And for Italians, it would be would be a wonder, no, something like that. On the other hand, so why is that not the case? Because in my view, it lacks the public sphere on European level. We have you talked about European actors, no, now, and others said a manifestation in Budapest maybe would be more transnational than one in Brussels. So I agree absolutely with that. So, but you will have, there is no media system that is reflecting and representing that in the whole level. When you take TV, that is in Italy very, very important for political issues, then there is no possibility that you can watch German TV in Italy, but there is no Swiss, no Austrian, no France, no others. They are all geo-blocked. And so my question is how to grasp that representation about something that's happening in protests. So in Italy, there is a strong protest for health system, to rescue health system, but it's the discussion, the debate is absolutely national. So quite nobody talks about the European impact on the national health system in Italy. And that's, I think, would be very interesting to see how we could develop that and how to make sure that we can make a transnational European public sphere of representation of these protest forms too, and to have more information about that.
Thank you. One point of strong support for your enterprise and three doubts that I have about the ways in which you have especially presented the data now. One strong support is that I think 350 events are extremely important. Hanspeter said, of course, 30,000 in 30 countries means 1,000 in each country. You have 350, could be a little bit less. But what we experience is that in part what Hans-Jörg said is true. So often transnational forms of protest are less covered. But especially what we notice in research on the European Social Forum, but also the European Citizens Initiative, the last one on non-profit for the pandemic, is that each event at the transnational level incorporates hundreds of events at different levels. It's much more difficult to organize, and so there is also higher investment in terms of the planning and the meaning that it has. I remember the first time that you invited me at the conference, it was with labor union activists talking about the difficulties that they had in the organizations also of European workers' councils and so on, because of the language, because of the last. So each of these events implies much more transformations than local events. And so I think it is extremely important that you look at them in detail, combining a large number with a more in-depth analysis. I have some more doubts about two other things. One is that you tend to present as an either-or. So it is a bit like when Robert Putnam, analyzing civic cultures, said the economic explanations is weaker than the cultural one. Let's forget about it, but it was still quite strong. And I think that in this way, just presenting the winner, you lose something from the point of view of analyzing also what Hanspeter said, some of the protests on the more socioeconomic issues framed in terms of horizontal competitions could have a different type of constellations and so be found also more at the level. So I think that it would be interesting to say your trend, the trend that you find, is very relevant, but how does it interact? Because what we know also about other protests is that often it is difficult to locate a protest once and forever under a certain type of label, because they tend to change, they tend to evolve, the same actors learn from other opportunities. Finally, also what I found a bit abrupt and maybe not so tight with the results that you presented is the end of class politics, the questions that Guglielmo addressed. And I think class has been defined in very different ways. So you take one Marxist definitions for that, but it is also contested how much the political. I think you can point at an interesting element, which is the more commodifications, so the more one could expect people would protest against the economic actors, the more they go instead to the political dimensions. But this is what the working class that you cited in the beginning to democracy has done. And so it could be just logic to expect that the more there the situations, the more difficult on the more economic class struggle, the more there is an investment in using political type of resources, the political exchange of Alessandro Pizzorno's analysis to counteract. And in this sense also, I think that even if you excluded them, but looking at the ways in which now the unions entered also other struggles could be interesting in this perspective. In terms of classes, in sociology of classes nowadays, there is a lot of attention to the Bourdieusian perspective, and I think it could help seeing to which extent Mike Savage also mentioned. It seems that we forget about classes in a moment in which they are culturally very relevant, but also there is that political tradition.
So thanks very much for all your comments. I start with the last one, and about class politics. So that was an ironic remark, I must admit, directed to a famous European political scientist who once gave an interview in the Swiss Wochenzeitung, in which he was much more direct than his academic writings. And he said, you know, class politics is something of the past, and only kind of young socialists still think in these terms. So that, of course, I agree what you have just said about class politics. So that was just kind of an inside joke. Sorry for that. Second point. I hope I didn't fall, maybe when I presented, I fell into the either or terminology, but in the article itself, in the conclusion I write, both are confirmed, and maybe one to a bigger degree to another. And I just want to highlight that when the Baccaros, but also the very good colleagues, Mark Anner and colleagues in the European Journal of Industrial Relations. So the focus was always on the creation of globalization and the economic transnational action. Maybe many of those scholars are also American, and therefore they looked at these economic trends because there is no political authority in other parts of Europe at the regional level to the same extent as in Europe. But I quote in the article also, the biggest events of transnational collective action in the Americas were also in relation to a political intervention, namely George W. Bush's plan to have an all-American free trade area of the Americans, or NAFTA also created transnational action, as Tamara Kay has said. So the political dimension is there also important. And I also think, I agree with you, we should learn from each other. And actually, me being forced to teach international human resource management in a business school helped me kind of understanding the new economic governance regime of the European Union, because it is based on a similar mechanism, not governing by law, but governing by key performance indicators and ad hoc interventions. So the European semester process mimics the process of governance that we have experienced in multinational enterprises, and which unions find it difficult to struggle against because they can actually be playoffed against each other, as the Germans were played off against the Greek in the crisis, or as now people, Stellantis workers, Fiat workers are kind of played off against each other. And that only works as long, however, as long as people realize that actually, you know, you can play off one against the other until you start realizing that you're played off against the other. So ironically, competition, there would be no trade union movement, there would be no social movement without competition, because they were invented precisely to counteract these competitive pressures. And it's, of course, a difficult protest that takes time. And it's, of course, true that RAI is kind of, or every newspaper or journal is focused on a transnational level. But actually, as an Irish in Dublin, I'm watching RAI 3 sometimes because I have a satellite dish. And there was a long discussion on the Stellantis crisis and the debate we have now in Italy about the punto, where is the electric punto to be produced? And the Fiat workers in Torino are very angry that they might lose the electric punto and it might go to Serbia. But then the RAI people went to Serbia and talked to the trade union workers in Serbia, and then they realized they are also, Stellantis is also firing the contracts and putting them out of business because they have found a third version to sideline them. And so maybe there is a basis of people in different parts realizing that in the end, so it's not an automatic process, but it shows that these games playing off one against each other, that it can be done, it can be overcome. And our little piece in the European Journal of Industrial Relations 2 years ago, on Ryanair is a good example. Because everybody has written about Ryanair as the company that will be least unionized. It's the most anti-union company that uses the most ferocious system of bashing unions and firing everybody that has only talk about the Works Council. So they couldn't have a European Works Council because they knew that it would be used to put them against each other. But they managed to unite workers even in Ryanair, which had to meet online with pseudonyms because they were fearful of being denounced to each other. But eventually they managed to unite across Europe thanks to a European law, thanks to European change in a European law, which doesn't read very dramatic. It is actually a change of the European flight time regulation which meant that the calendar year for the calculation of maximum working hours of pilots should be aligned to the calendar year and not to the business year. And that meant that in 2017, the Ryanair year had to be limited to 9 months. And that is important because in November, December, there's the biggest season for Ryanair. And so they couldn't send their workers on holidays. So they couldn't break the strike. So trade unions kind of united and threatened transnational strike action and actually broke Ryanair and convinced them to accept trade unions based on a law, a social law of the European Union that even Ryanair lawyers thought it is not that important. So that shows also that happily not everything works out as predicted, even by the Ryanair lawyers. And I hope, if anything, that our discussion encourages more colleagues and students and young scholars here in the room to continue this field, because I really think this transnational field is something that ought to be studied a bit more precisely.
Thank you very much. And your last hope, I think, is already fulfilled, because there is a growing interest in the transnational labor as transnational form of protest, but also in the interactions between us and UCD. And you know that we will continue this discussion. So thank you, Hanspeter. Thank you, Guglielmo. Thank you to all of you. And we will have a full calendar for the next few.
The next one is on the 14th afternoon. Do you remember the time? 3 o'clock, 3 p.m. with Dominique Méda on the value of work. So we are in a labor phase. Okay.
Very much. Thank you. Grazie.